There are moments in life that seem to freeze time. For Yaman, one of those moments would remain forever engraved in his heart, a night when Demet Özdemir, the woman who had been his confidant, his partner, and at one time, his secret love, broke down in silence. She cried in his arms, and said nothing. To the world, Can is the strong, fiery man who never bends under pressure, the charming actor whose presence dominates every screen. But behind closed doors, away from the flashing cameras, there was a softer side that only very few had ever seen. Demet had been one of them. It all began during the height of their careers. They had just wrapped up another exhausting day of filming, the set buzzing with energy even long after the director had yelled cut. Fans saw only the magic on screen, the smiles, the spark, the chemistry so natural it felt impossible to fake. But no one knew how much weight the two were carrying behind those scenes. Fame, expectations, and whispers of romance followed them everywhere. Every word they spoke, every glance they exchanged, was magnified into headlines. Yet, in that moment, under the quiet of night, the world had disappeared. Ken had always described himself as someone who preferred action over words. But that night, as Demet buried her face into his chest, tears wetting his shirt, he realized that sometimes silence was more powerful than any confession. She didn't have to say a word, her trembling body told him everything. He held her tighter, unsure whether to comfort her with promises or let the silence speak for itself. The air in the room was heavy, charged with emotions left unspoken. For Ken, it felt as though he was holding not just Demet, but also the weight of all the moments they had lived, every stolen smile on set, every inside joke, every time their eyes had met and lingered just a second too long. It wasn't just about love, or longing, or even regret. It was about two souls colliding at the wrong time, in the wrong place, but still unable to deny the connection that bound them. That memory, she cried in my arms and said nothing, would later become a wound and a blessing for Ken. A wound because he never got the answers he longed for. A blessing because in her silence, he found a truth he had been afraid to face, that sometimes, the most profound love is the one that cannot be spoken aloud. And yet, that very night would haunt him, replaying in his mind again and again, especially whenever life pushed them apart. After that unforgettable night, Ken found himself replaying every detail in his head. The sound of Demet's quiet sobs, the way her hands clutched at his shirt as if she was afraid to let go, and most of all, the silence. He had expected words. Maybe an explanation, maybe even a confession. But instead, she had given him nothing but tears. And that silence screamed louder than anything she could have said. For days, Ken wondered what she had been holding back. Was it regret? Was it fear of what might happen if she admitted how she truly felt? Or was it simply exhaustion, the pressure of fame crushing her spirit until she could no longer put it into words? Whatever it was, Ken couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had changed forever. On set, they carried on as professionals. The cameras rolled, the director shouted instructions, and their characters lived out a love story that captivated millions of viewers. But off camera, there was a tension that no one else seemed to notice. Their eyes would meet for a second too long, then quickly look away. They laughed together as always, but behind those smiles, there was a fragility neither dared to acknowledge. Ken remembered how, after that night, Demet seemed more guarded. She would arrive on set with her usual energy, but when the cameras weren't looking, there was a heaviness in her eyes. He wanted to ask her what was wrong, to demand answers, but something inside told him to respect her silence. He knew Demet well enough to understand that if she wanted to talk, she would. And if she chose not to, it was because the words would hurt more than the silence. The irony wasn't lost on him. To the outside world, their chemistry was effortless, their relationship the subject of endless speculation. Fans and media painted them as a real-life love story unfolding before their eyes. But in reality, the truth was far more complicated. Behind the glitter of fame and the carefully crafted image, two people were caught in an emotional storm they couldn't control. Ken often thought about the fragile line between their on-screen roles and their real lives. Playing lovers on screen was easy, lines were scripted, emotions rehearsed. But in real life, feelings were raw, unfiltered, and terrifying. That night, when Demet had cried in his arms, she had blurred that line completely. She had shown him a side of herself that no script could ever capture. And that vulnerability had pierced straight through him. Even as he smiled for interviews and brushed off questions about their relationship, Ken carried that memory with him everywhere. He knew he couldn't erase it, no matter how much he tried. In the silence of that night, Demet had left a mark on his soul that would never fade. And though she hadn't spoken, her tears had told him more than any words ever could. Ken often wondered if fate had played a cruel trick on them. How could two people who seemed destined to be so perfectly aligned find themselves trapped in silence? Every time he thought back to that night, he remembered the warmth of her body against his, her tears soaking into his shirt, and the way her lips trembled as if she wanted to speak but chose not to. That choice, her silence, became the heaviest memory he carried. In the days that followed, he caught himself analyzing every gesture. When Demet looked away too quickly, when she laughed but her eyes didn't shine, when she avoided being alone with him for too long, Ken saw it all. He was a man known for his intensity, his boldness, his refusal to play games. But with Demet, he suddenly found himself afraid. Afraid of pushing too hard, afraid of hearing something he wasn't ready for. There were nights when Ken couldn't sleep, lying awake in his apartment in Rome, wondering what Demet had wanted to say. He thought about picking up the phone, calling her, asking her directly. But then he would stop himself. If she hadn't spoken that night, maybe she never would. Maybe her silence was the answer. Still, the memory lingered. On film sets, during interviews, even in the middle of glamorous events where flashing cameras surrounded him, his mind would drift back to that quiet night. The world saw him as untouchable, confident, even arrogant. But inside, he carried the image of Demet's tears like a secret wound. It was the kind of pain he couldn't share with anyone, not his family, not his closest friends, not even himself in the mirror. Sometimes, Ken wondered if Demet regretted that moment. Did she wish she had spoken? Did she replay it in her own mind, wondering what might have happened if she had confessed, or explained, or simply whispered something into the silence? He would never know. And that uncertainty was worse than any truth. It wasn't just about love, it was about timing, about trust, about the walls they both had built around themselves. Demet had her fears, her boundaries, her way of protecting her heart from the chaos of fame. Ken had his pride, his intensity, his need for clarity. When those two worlds collided, the result was silence. A silence so heavy it felt louder than a scream. But despite everything, Ken couldn't bring himself to resent her. How could he? That night had also been a gift, a moment of raw honesty without a single word spoken. For once, there were no cameras, no scripts, no fans. Just two people, broken and vulnerable, holding on to each other in a way the world would never understand. And that was the truth of his memory. She cried in his arms, and said nothing, but in that nothing, there was everything. As weeks turned into months, Ken realized that the silence of that night had become a shadow following them everywhere. On screen, their characters spoke of love, passion, and promises. But off-screen, a quiet distance had started to grow. It wasn't coldness, no, it was something deeper, something more delicate. Like a wound neither dared to touch, afraid it might never heal. Demet, in her own way, tried to move forward. She smiled during press interviews, posed for photos, and even posted light-hearted moments on social media. To the world, she was radiant, glowing as always. But Ken had seen the truth. He remembered the way her shoulders had shaken in his arms, the way her tears had carried the weight of words left unsaid. That wasn't something one could simply erase with a smile for the cameras. There were moments when Ken thought about confronting her. He wanted to ask her, "Why did you cry? What did you want to tell me?" But every time he looked into her eyes, he stopped himself. He knew the answer was there, hidden in her silence. And perhaps, deep down, he was terrified of hearing it. What if her truth shattered the fragile bond they still had? What if her silence was the only thing keeping them from breaking completely? One evening, during a wrap party for their show, Ken found himself watching Demet from across the room. She was laughing with friends, her head tilted back, her smile effortless. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined everything. Maybe that night hadn't meant as much to her as it had to him. Maybe the tears were just exhaustion, maybe the silence was just fear of vulnerability. But then, their eyes met across the room. And in that single glance, Ken knew, she remembered. She felt it too. That silent understanding between them was both comforting and painful. Comforting, because it proved the moment had been real. Painful, because it confirmed that neither of them had the courage to turn it into words. They were two actors, masters of performance, yet when it came to their own truth, they were paralyzed. Ken carried that memory like a secret diary locked inside his heart. He never spoke of it publicly, never hinted at it in interviews. Even when fans speculated endlessly about their relationship, even when journalists pushed for answers, he remained silent. Because that memory was sacred. It wasn't for headlines, it wasn't for gossip. It was theirs. And yet, the irony was cruel. The silence that had bound them in that moment was the same silence that slowly built a wall between them. They drifted apart, each taking different paths, different projects, different lives. But no matter how far they went, the memory followed. It haunted Ken in quiet hotel rooms, in lonely flights between countries, in every fleeting reminder of what could have been. She cried in my arms, and said nothing. That line repeated in his head like a song with no ending. And though it brought him pain, he also clung to it. Because in that silence, he had seen her heart. And even if the world would never know, he would never forget. Years passed, but that single memory refused to fade. Ken moved forward in his career, conquering Italy, earning international fame, and becoming one of the most recognizable faces in the industry. Demet, too, soared to new heights, carving her own path and building a name admired by millions. Yet, no amount of success could erase what had happened between them on that quiet night. She cried in my arms, and said nothing. For Ken, those words became both a burden and a secret comfort. Whenever he felt lost, whenever he doubted the choices he had made, he returned to that memory. It reminded him that behind the glitz and glamour, behind the flashing cameras and scripted lines, there was once something real, something raw, that no one else would ever fully understand. In interviews, fans often asked him about his past, about Demet, about whether their on-screen chemistry had ever crossed into real life. Ken always gave the same carefully measured answers, smiling politely, avoiding the truth. Because the truth wasn't something he could share. The truth was fragile, sacred, and bound by silence. It was hers as much as it was his. And so, he protected it. But late at night, when the world grew quiet, that moment returned to him. He would close his eyes and see her face pressed against his chest, feel the weight of her trembling shoulders, hear the silence that said everything. And he wondered, if she had spoken that night, would their story have ended differently? Would they have fought harder, loved braver, stayed together longer? Or was silence the only way their love could survive, existing forever as a memory instead of being destroyed by reality? Ken would never know the answer. And perhaps, that was why the memory held so much power. It was unfinished, unspoken, unresolved. A puzzle piece left missing, forcing his heart to fill the gaps with longing. And yet, for all the pain it caused him, he would never trade it away. Because in that silence, in that night, Demet had shown him her truest self. No cameras, no scripts, no words, just tears. And those tears spoke louder than any declaration of love ever could. So whenever Ken thought about the story of his life, the triumphs, the heartbreaks, the endless headlines, he always came back to that one chapter. Not the glamorous premieres, not the wild success, not the awards or the fame. But to a night when the world disappeared, when time stood still, and when she cried in his arms and said nothing. And maybe, just maybe, that was the purest love of all.